Lighting's good.
Lighting's good. Space
Yeah.
is about what it was.
Yeah.
Okay. How's my horror?
Your hair's good.
Horror's good.
I'm filming you right now.
Are you? Hello and welcome to another video. If you're new here, my name is Erin and I'm so glad to have you visiting my channel today. Today's video is going to be a reading wrap-up of all the books I've read between the month of January and March. And I have a fair number of books to get through, so without further ado, let's just dive right into the video. Between January and March, I have read 11 books, and I'm going to be going through them in the order in which I finished reading them, which isn't necessarily the order in which I started reading them, but just for simplicity's sake, we'll go with when I finish each of the books. And if you see me glancing off to the right here, I'm just referring to my notes because most of the books that I read over the past 3 months were books that I borrowed from my library. So I have a lot of notes off to the side so that I don't have to keep it all up in my head. The first book that I finished in 2024 was Good Omens, The Nice and Accurate Prophecies of Agnes Witch by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. I specifically read the BBC Radio full cast dramatization, and this was actually by mistake. I had thought when I was looking on the Libby app that I had found the full book, not realizing that it was essentially just the dialogue that was being performed. So it was a much more condensed version of the story. It was very entertaining. I will say that because I went into the listening experience thinking it was going to be like a typical audiobook where you have characters talking, but then also descriptions of the scene and what's going on, I was a bit confused at first and kept waiting for there to be explanation of what's going on in the scene. But it was purely dialogue between the characters, and there was a full cast, and all of the voice actors were excellent. It was a really immersive reading experience, and I especially liked that they had bloopers at the very end of the audiobook, which just made it all the more fun because I appreciate bloopers. And I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. I think because I didn't have any familiarity with the story itself, just listening to the dialogue between the characters left me with some questions. I have since watched a few episodes of the TV series adaptation, and it is really, really good. I feel like I'm appreciating the story more because now not only have I heard the story as a dramatization, but I'm also getting to see the story unfold. And it was really interesting because there were some scenes when I was listening to the book that I didn't quite understand what was going on purely from the dialogue, but getting to see it in the TV series, it made more sense to me. So I think if I eventually go back and read the full unabridged story, I will probably like it a lot more. It's a very clever story. It follows an angel and a demon who have been interacting with humankind since the beginning, since the Garden of Eden. And they sort of have this secret alliance between them. They also have grown very fond of humans over the centuries. And it's really such a funny story. And sort of the main event that the angel and demon are trying to avert from happening is the apocalypse. If the apocalypse happens, then the world as they have come to enjoy it and love it will no longer be the same. And so, yeah, they secretly team up and try to prevent the apocalypse, and lots of hilarity ensues. So if you are curious about silly sort of slapstick humor story, Good Omens is a very funny one to read. The next book that I finished this year is Goblin Mode: How to Get Cozy, Embrace Imperfection, and Thrive in the Muck by Michaela Coyle. If you watched my 24-hour readathon, then you would have seen me start to read this book. It is a nonfiction book, and it addresses, what does it mean to be a goblin and to embrace the goblin core lifestyle. And it was actually surprisingly very charming. It was a very lighthearted read, and there were certain things that I took away from it, like how I have a tendency to save jars, and I will pick up like tiny little pine cones when I go on walks. I have come to realize that I have some goblin tendencies, and one of the things that really surprised me about the book also addressed some of the issues around goblin folklore across time, and how goblins have often been depicted in a way that promotes anti-Semitism and the problems with that. And so if you are taking on this personality trait of being a goblin, you are simultaneously rejecting anti-Semitism. So that was a part of the book that I was pleasantly surprised by. It felt like it really gave the book some depth. And yeah, I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. It was a very sweet read, very lighthearted, very enjoyable, and it was a good one to start out the year with. The next book that I finished was actually a bilingual book. One of my goals for 2024 is to continue learning French on my own. I will put a disclaimer here that I am completely self-taught with French. I have not learned formally. The book that I read next was 10 Frogs. And I was debating on whether or not I wanted to attempt to pronounce the French titles of some of the books that I've read in French this year, because I realized that my pronunciation, especially with some French words that I'm not very familiar with, my accent is really terrible, and I don't want to offend any native French speakers. 10 Frogs was written by Quentin Blake, and I believe was also illustrated. And I gave it 3 stars because it's a very basic bilingual children's book. You are learning numbers in French, and you're also learning different animal names in French. I enjoyed the illustrations. I didn't give it higher than 3 stars just because it was simply a counting story. There wasn't a plot beyond counting 1 through 10 and learning different animal names. But it was a good one, especially for where I am in learning French, because some of the other books, which I'll talk about a little bit later, that were in French, even though they're children's books, the sentence structure and the vocabulary were more advanced than what I have learned so far. The next book that I finished was my very first 5-star read of 2024, and that book is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. If you are familiar with Charles Dickens' David Copperfield, there are so many clever parallels between the two. Demon Copperhead is set in more modern times, and it is in southern Appalachia within the United States, and it follows the titular character Demon Copperhead, which is actually the character's nickname. His real name is Damon. It is not a lighthearted read. It is incredibly good and brings up so many good points and problems within the United States, some of which include the foster care system, the opioid crisis within the United States, all sorts of really heavy topics that are very important. But yeah, it's one that took me a while to get through. I definitely had to take little breaks because I just felt so badly for Damon. He really had a rough start in life, being born to a single mother who struggled with, alcohol and drug abuse. And he then eventually becomes an orphan and has to go through the foster care system. There's so much trauma, but the character of Damon just has this resilient spirit, and despite all of the hardships that he goes through, he keeps this sort of spark for life, which I found very refreshing, considering everything that his character goes through over the course of, the period of his life that we read about in the story. I don't think that many people would have had that spark for life remain. He goes through some pretty grim stuff, but yeah, he's a fighter for sure. And I just really, really admired his character. I loved the care that Barbara Kingsolver took with this story, and the way that she interpreted Charles Dickens' classic and reinterpreted it for the modern age, and specifically, setting it in the US. It felt so close to home for the part of the US that I've grown up in, because I have seen areas that are described in Demon Copperhead. I do know some people that have gone through struggles similar to some of the characters within Demon Copperhead. So it just hit differently. And don't get me wrong, I love Charles Dickens, but I think when you're reading something like Dickens, obviously a lot of his characters go through hardships as well. But I think as a modern reader, you can sometimes feel a bit removed from that hardship because we don't really know what it's like to work in a workhouse as a child. I felt like I was more able to connect with Damon and the other characters within Demon Copperhead more easily than I could connect with some of the characters in Charles Dickens' David Copperfield. You just have to give it a read. I started out reading the physical book and then ended up switching to the audiobook. The voice actor who narrates the story does an excellent job and has a very convincing Southern Appalachia accent. So if you like listening to audiobooks, the voice actor for Demon Copperhead is excellent. The next book that I finished was To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This one was a reread for me. I had read this in college, but when I started reading this book this year, I realized that I didn't remember the plot very clearly. I also struggled to understand what was going on in this book at first. I started reading the physical copy and I was going so slowly at it. The narration in this story jumps between characters. This book is broken up into 3 parts, and the middle part, the narrator is actually time itself, which was actually ended up being my favorite section. But I think that because I hadn't read a Virginia Woolf novel in a bit, I struggled with this one, getting into it, and I wanted to really enjoy it. And one of the goals that I have for this year is not to just read a ton of books, but I want to improve my reading comprehension and be able to appreciate books like To the Lighthouse. And this one definitely challenged me. So I think I got through about 25% reading the physical copy, and I just was not entirely clear on what was going on and who all of the characters were. So I ended up listening to one of the audiobook That is our rice cooker. So I ended up listening to an audiobook version of this story while also reading along physically. And I decided to start the book completely over, even though I was 25% through it already, because I wanted to really appreciate the story. And something about having a person reading it to me at the rhythm that it was intended and with the right pauses and having slightly different voices for the different characters, it made a world of difference for me. One of the things that Virginia Woolf did in this book, there aren't always obvious paragraph breaks to alert the reader that the narrator and the perspective has shifted. Sometimes it'll just quickly shift. And sometimes it'll shift within the same paragraph. So having someone read it to me as I'm reading the text made a world of difference. And then once I got into the rhythm of the story, I absolutely loved it. I really connected with a lot of the characters. And this story is set on the Isle of Skye in northern Scotland. And it follows this family who has a summer home on the Isle of Skye, and they are having several guests stay with them. And the first part actually happens pretty much in one day. And then the second part, as I mentioned, is narrated by time itself. And so that section of the story spans years. And within that second part, you don't know exactly how many years have gone by. But then when you get to the third part, you get some more details about how much time has passed. And that is when some of the characters return to the house on the Isle of Skye, and some of them end up taking a boat to go to the lighthouse. And yeah, this book had a lot of heart, and I was really surprised. I'm so glad that I restarted it, and I'm so glad that I didn't allow my ego to get in the way of enjoying this book, because that's the thing about reading. When you challenge yourself to read a genre or an author that is outside of your comfort zone, sometimes you don't pick up on what's happening right away, and that's okay. And so by the time I finished this book, I felt so accomplished. I felt like not only had I read the book, but I had such a deeper appreciation for it. And I was really proud of myself that I persevered and didn't give up when I had no clue what was going on. I ended up giving this book 4.5 stars. It was beautifully written, and as I said, the second part was probably my favorite, but it wasn't a 5-star read because overall it just left me feeling a little sad. But yeah, 4.5 stars. And I highly recommend, if you've not read a lot of Virginia Woolf, reading a physical copy alongside listening to the audiobook, particularly for this one, can be really helpful. The next book that I finished was Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. This book was one that I had seen recommended online by lots of different booktubers, and it was a really quick read, and I really enjoyed it. I ended up giving it 4 stars. I read the ebook version and read it just a little bit each night for, I think, maybe like a week. And it was such a sweet and heartwarming book, for me at least. And this book follows the character of Kiko, who works in a convenience store in Tokyo, and she expresses the sort of confusion that she has around interacting with people, and this sort of frustration that she has with society telling her that she needs to get a real job and not work in a convenience store, even though she absolutely loves it. Also society telling her that she needs to get married, have a husband, have kids in order to be successful. It's a very short book, so I won't give away any more of the plot because otherwise I'd be telling you the whole story. But it is one that I just really appreciated the character. I loved getting to see the story through her eyes, and I was just really delighted by the story. So Convenience Store Woman is one that I highly recommend, especially if you want a shorter book that is a lighter read. The next book that I finished was another bilingual children's book, and that is Pierre and Paul Dragon by Caroline Adderson. This was my second 5-star read for 2024. And the reason I gave this one 5 stars is because this is truly a bilingual children's book. And I didn't realize when I borrowed it from the library that it would not just be like, here's a sentence in English and then the French translation. This story actually follows the two characters, Pierre and Paul, and follows them as they are taking out the trash for trash day, and they end up having this adventure where they encounter a dragon. Neither of them is fluent in the other's language, and so they are each speaking in their native language and will occasionally use the other's language with certain words. And there are sections within the book that have both the English and the French. So it will show like a particular object. And yeah, like here's a good example. It will show the objects and then describe it in both English and French. And I just thought this was such a sweet and clever book. And it really felt like I was observing these two friends who are playing together. And even though they're not fluent in one another's language, they still communicate and they still play and they have a great time. This, I think, was really, really helpful for me as far as introducing new French vocabulary and sentence structure, because it felt like a real life bilingual conversation. And the illustrations are absolutely adorable in this book. So yeah, this is one that I highly recommend if you are learning French and yeah, you want to read something that's told in 2 languages. The next book that I finished was There by Tommy Orange. I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars. It was such an impactful book. It is one that covers, again, a lot of really important topics. There follows several characters whose stories are intertwined, who are all coming together for various reasons to the big powwow in Oakland, California. This book is told from the perspective of several different characters, and it spans a variety of years depending upon which character is telling their story at that point within the book. And the reason I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars instead of, something a little bit higher, the topics that were covered are absolutely important. Like, this is a very crucial book to be out there and for people to read. I just had a little trouble with some of the characterization and also the structure of the story. I listened to the audiobook, and maybe there were a few different actors who were narrating parts of the story. And so, of course, some of the actors had to do multiple characters, and they tried to do different voices, but I got the male characters really mixed up, even though I knew they were different characters, but I just couldn't keep them clear in my mind. All of the female characters I was totally fine with, like they were very distinct within my mind, but a lot of the male characters, I got them so confused, and I would pause the audiobook, go like Google, you know, okay, like who's this character again, and try to like keep it clear in my mind. That was like one problem that I had with it. Like there were distinctive qualities between the characters, but there were some male characters that I felt like they were just, I don't know, they got muddled for me. And I don't know if that was a matter of they just had too many similar characteristics and that's why they got mixed up in my head, or maybe I'm the problem. Either way, it was a 3.5 star read for me. It's one that I do recommend. It's not a lighthearted read. It covers a lot of really hard topics. There are definitely some content warnings, so Google those if you don't want to read about gun violence and other types of, you know, violence. The next book that I read was another French children's book, and that one does not have an English title, so I'm going to do my best to pronounce this correctly. It is La Rencontre Gaspard et Lisa by Anne Gutman. I gave this one 2 stars. It was a cute story, but I guess it just wasn't appealing to me. It is part of a series, from what I understand, that follows these 2 characters, you know, throughout their friendship. And one is a black dog and one is a white dog. And this particular story is, I think, when their characters first meet. I haven't read any of the other stories that follow them, but from what I gathered, it's when these 2 meet at school, and everyone at the school keeps commenting on how you look just alike, you could be brother and sister, and it drives them both crazy. And they end up getting into a fight and a confrontation, but then they end up participating in like a relay race for their school and end up winning. And through that experience of having to be teammates, they end up settling their differences and become best friends. So it was cute, but it was a little predictable. I also felt like, as a children's book, the sentence structure was pretty advanced, especially for where I am in my learning. I had to look up a lot of the translations to understand the story because it was completely in French. 2 stars. It was okay. The next book that I finished was another French children's book, and this one is Père La Chevalerie. I'm probably mispronouncing that. I did look it up and I'm trying my best. And this book is by Marie Dariescu. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that. Basically, this is Père, and this word means knight, as in a knight in shining armor. I gave this book 3 stars. It was an adventure sort of story, and it follows the character Père, and she comes upon this prince who is playing, I think it's a guitar, or is it a harp? He's playing a certain instrument and he's singing, and she is drawn to him and wants to potentially marry him. Oh, he's playing the mandolin. So she goes to his mother, the queen, and basically asks for his hand in marriage. And the queen says, well, you have to complete these 3 quests. I thought this was really cute and a real fun twist on sort of, you know, the knight in shining armor that comes for the princess. I liked that it did like a gender swap for the characters, and the illustrations are really pretty. I loved the bright colors that they used for the horse. It was a really sweet one, and I had a little bit better luck understanding this one, but still had to have a dictionary with me. The last book that I read which I finished just at the end of March, was The Empath Survival Guide, Life Strategies for Sensitive People by Judith Orloff. This book I gave 2 stars. It was one that I honestly didn't want to finish, but the reason that I did is I had requested it from the Libby app, and there was such a long wait for it that by the time I was able to borrow it, I didn't want to only read part of it, just in case, you know, later in the book there was a point in which I ended up enjoying it. However, I did not, but I'm still glad that I finished the book. There were a few chapters that I felt resonated with me a little bit. I think the problem that I had with the book is that some of the strategies were very much based upon someone having a certain economic and financial status. For example, the author recommends that for empaths to calm their nervous system, that they use essential oils, which are great, and I love essential oils, but not everyone can afford essential oils. It's definitely something that only people with disposable income can afford. Or there were some recommendations about going to like a Reiki specialist or acupuncturist. And again, you have to have extra income to afford those types of therapies. So she never addressed what empaths can do to, you know, get through day-to-day life if they don't have additional income. So I really had a problem with that aspect of the book, because I do believe that empaths are real, like it's a real lived experience. I consider myself an empath, and while I do have a home that I live in and I can afford, you know, to buy groceries and that sort of thing, like I can't just go to a guru whenever I start to feel overwhelmed. And there are people who are also empaths who have a lot less financial stability than I do. And I just don't think that it's fair to give these life strategies that only serves a certain economic class. So yeah, it felt a little classist to me. And that's where I had issues with it, and why it got 2 stars. It's just not one that I really care to recommend, and I don't feel interested in reading any other books by this author personally. And those are all the books that I have read between January and March of this year. As for my annual reading goal, I am on track. I am 25% through my reading goal for the year, and I have read 11 out of 44 books. So I feel pretty good. And I am in the middle of several books at the moment, and I don't think I'll have trouble meeting my annual goal. Let me know in the comments how many 5-star reads you've had so far this year. And I would like to give a special thank you to my patrons who are supporting my channel and my creative work. Over on Patreon, I create bonus content, I host a book club, and I also produce an exclusive audio series called Soothing Stories. If you're curious to check it out, I will link that in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are enjoying the books that you're reading this year so far. And until next time, I hope you have a lovely and cozy book to curl up with. Bye-bye.